So I do intend to devote this class and much of the next class to ideas and to the theoretical and philosophical presuppositions of this argument and to the ideas that we need to develop our programmatic conceptions. In particular, to three sets of ideas. First of all, to ideas about structure, structural change, structural discontinuity, and structural alternatives in history, and how to think about them. Second, to ideas about agency, how to think about the agents of such alternatives, the political alliances and the social alliances or class alliances. And the ideas about agency result very closely from the ideas about structure. And the third set of ideas are ideas about the ideal, the normative orientation of the argument, and the conception of humanity that is presupposed in the programmatic ideas that I have been exploring here. But before I turn to that agenda, the last agenda in the course, I want to deal briefly with a theme that has come up from time to time in our earlier arguments, which is the relation of national alternatives to global alternatives. So it will be a limited part of this class that I now devote to the discussion of globalization and its alternative forms. So that discussion must be very succinct. So I begin with three ideas. The first idea is that just as the market economy can take different forms, or democracy can take different forms, so too globalization can take different forms. There is no single natural or necessary form of globalization. So we shouldn't restrict our ideological conceptions to a choice of more market or less market, but rather ask which market order, and the same goes for globalization. It shouldn't be simply or primarily a debate about more globalization or less globalization, but the central question is, which globalization? What is the direction? The second idea is that the established form of globalization, one of the possible directions of globalization, does impose constraints on national projects, including on the kinds of alternatives that I have been exploring here. But they are constraints that leave a large room for response. They do not impose a single line of response. And we know this for a fact. If we compare the way in which different countries and different regions of the world have responded to the same constraints of the established form of globalization. So, for example, compare and contrast with respect to development strategy, Latin America in the period since the Second World War, and China. They have responded very differently. One of the elements of the predominant Latin American response to the constraints of globalization has been the reliance on what you could describe as a functional equivalent to the 19th century gold standard. You know, the gold standard, making the money depend on a basis in metal and gold, reached its height in the period between 1870 and 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, and was at the heart of the previous episode of globalization. It has been described by the Polish Marxist economist Kalecki, the gold standard, as a device that made the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. Now, what I'm describing as the functional equivalent to the gold standard in Latin America is a syndrome of policies that included the following elements. Acceptance of a very low level of domestic saving, both private and public. Second, consequent reliance on foreign saving, on foreign capital to fund development. And third, as an immediate consequence of that second element, relative opening of the capital account, opening to capital flows. And now you could include a fourth element in this syndrome that has a looser connection to the other three, but is connected to them. And that is acceptance of the penetration of the production system of the national economy by foreign multinationals. Very early in a strategy of development. So typically in many of the major Latin American economies, the multinationals were allowed to acquire and control the intermediate stages of production. The state might control some of basic industry and resource extraction, but the multinationals controlled the industries of transformation, the production of for example, durable consumer goods. Now, by contrast, China, and not just China, but the so-called Northeast Asian tiger economies, were resistant early in their development strategies to the dependence on foreign capital. They insisted on achieving a high level of domestic saving. They tightly controlled the capital account. And at the early stages of their rise, they preferred loan capital to risk capital because they did not want the national production system to be penetrated and controlled by foreign money. Now, the Latin American syndrome, which I'm calling a functional equivalent to the 19th century gold standard, had as its effect not just its unintended consequence, but its desired outcome to tie the hands of national governments. In the room of maneuver that they had, to establish rebellious strategies of national development. It made the national government or the whole economy depend on foreign capital and therefore on foreign confidence in national development strategy. And this dependence, rather than being seen as a flaw by the proponents of this approach, was viewed as an advantage because it was supposed to prevent national governments from embarking on populist and nationalist adventurism. So the result was drastically to restrict the area of maneuver of these Latin American governments in the response to the same constraints of globalization. Now, one could generalize the point polemically in the following way. On the whole, for a large part of this historical period, Latin America was the region of the world that suffered the starkest decline in its relative position in world economic growth, as compared to Northeast Asia and later China. And one can then generalize the lesson. The lesson is that in history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. This is what we find in this historical experience. It illustrates the point what I'm calling the second idea about globalization, that the particular form of globalization established in the world does impose constraints, but these constraints allow for a significant range of different response, as this comparative contrast illustrates. The third idea, to which I will return at the end of these remarks about globalization, is that the redirection of globalization, its reshaping, is very unlikely to come from the top. That is to say, as the gift of an enlightened, reform-minded cosmopolitan elite. It will come, if it comes at all, only as the result of pressure from below. And pressure in the form of strong national projects that begin advancing within the constraints of the present form of globalization, but ultimately hit against those constraints and can advance further only by a transformation of the global order. So there would have to be a number of countries, of states that converge and ally because they have a common stake in the reshaping of the global order. Now, what I mean by strong national projects are projects that involve a large-scale mobilization of national resources physical, economic, financial, and human, as the base of a development strategy. And second, that take the form of distinct institutional arrangements. Institutional arrangements that are not just copies of the arrangements recommended by the then dominant powers in the world order. So you could say that the alternatives that I have been discussing with you in the course as progressive alternatives are a subset of such strong national projects. The subset of the strong national projects characterized by the focus on the broad-based enhancement of agency, of economic, political, and cultural agency of the mass of ordinary people. Now, with these general ideas in mind, let me turn back again to an example that I gave before, just to illustrate the kind of discussion of alternatives of globalization that would serve as a counterpart to the discussion we have had earlier in the course about alternative forms of the market order. So I come back to the example of the world trading system. As organized today under the aegis of the WTO treaties, but even more significantly of the multilateral trade agreements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Partnership. So there are three main domains of the global order: the world security arrangements, force, especially military force, and its control and use; the world monetary order; and the world trade order. And I'm going to focus for this example on the world trade order. But we have to have a parallel discussion in each of those two other domains. And of course, of the three, the most important are the security arrangements, the ones that have to do with military force. So the particular form of the world trade regime that is being organized under these arrangements is characterized by a number of organizing principles, to each of which there is an alternative that would be required for the ultimate development of the strong national projects, including the subset of those projects explored here. So the first principle is to maximize free trade, as if free trade were an end in itself. And the contrast to that idea is the notion that free trade is not an end in itself. The end is the coexistence in a world order that gradually becomes more open of alternative development strategies and alternative experiences of civilization. And this idea is in accord with the conception that I argued before of the role of the national difference in the world. The nations, if they are not to be tribes or imaginary tribes, are to be experiments in humanity, in different ways of being human. So we should not want an order that forces the champions of national difference to become enemies of openness in the world, including economic or commercial openness. So that's the first and fundamental contrast. And of course, right there, there's a deep problem. Because we would say we do not want an unqualified pluralism. We would want a qualified pluralism. That is, those experiments in alternatives that retain a commitment to economic, political, and cultural pluralism, and that are open, that make themselves corrigible, that allow the participants to struggle to change them, and when necessary, to escape them. But we do not yet in the world have the means to impose this qualified pluralism. The second organizing principle is the one that earlier in the course I described as institutional maximalism. It's the principle of the World Trade Regime. As it is evolving under the framework of these arrangements, the trade regime imposes on the participant states the requirement to adhere not just to the market economy in the abstract, in any possible form, but to a very particular variant of the market economy. So, it is a variant, for example, that wants to outlaw, under the label subsidies, all forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms. The same forms of strategic coordination that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich. Or to take another example, it wants to incorporate into the rules of world trade the entire established system of the law of intellectual property as it developed since the end of the 19th century. And none of these add-ons or incorporations are essential to the idea of a market, and they represent, in their cumulative force, if we extend the list, a vast restriction of the area of experimental freedom of the participant states. Now, this institutional maximalism, institutional and legal maximalism, is not necessary to economic openness. We know that it's not necessary because it was not characteristic of what came before. It was not characteristic of what came immediately before the WTO and multilateral arrangements of today. That was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which was characterized by an institutional minimalism, minimal restraints on institutional and legal experimentation. And for centuries before, it was not characteristic of the way in which trade among different countries and empires was organized in the world through the law merchant. Because the whole purpose of the law merchant, of international commercial law, was to organize commerce among underlying jurisdictions with radically different laws. and to minimize the extent to which effective trade required legal harmonization or convergence. And under that system of this legal and institutional minimalism, we know that there were vast variations in the degree of economic openness and trade in the world. The third organizing principle of the established trade regime is the radical contrast that it imposes between the mobility that it demands for goods and services and for capital, and the immobility that it imposes on labor. So the general rule is money and things are to be, as soon as possible, as free as possible to roam the world, but people are to be arrested within the nation state or in blocks of relatively homogeneous nation states like the European Union. You might say that there is no basis in economic and political theory for such a radical distinction between the treatment of the different factors of production. Of course, labor mobility could not be achieved in a radical and sudden form in one big swoop. Nothing would be more revolutionary in the world. All the governments in the world would be overthrown. And just as an empirical matter, we know that the nothing contributes more to equality among states, among nations, than an increase in labor mobility. All the empirical evidence confirms that. But it can't be achieved all at once, suddenly. The question is the direction. So, labor mobility can advance only in steps, and in steps with two kinds of qualifications: safeguards for the receiving countries. So there's stages, and there's a vast spectrum between at one pole being a guest worker and at the other pole becoming a full citizen. And compensations for the sending country, which may have invested in the formation of people and then lose those people. But there is vast material and moral interest in facilitating the direction. And not just for the sake of greater equality, but because this circulation of people and their experiences and ideas in the world is an intrinsic part of the process by which humanity becomes both different and unified, as if it were a vast shuffling of the cards in the world, in which new difference can be perpetually created through these combinations of experiences and peoples in the world. So what would be the alternative? The alternative is that things, money, and freedom and people gain freedom together in small cumulative steps, rather than there being this radical contrast between the mobility for things and for capital and the immobility of labor. So that's just a simplified account of the alternative or an alternative, a global alternative in the specific domain of trade. Now, you could add a fourth element, and the fourth contrast would be on the question of labor, free labor. So, and this goes to the issue of it being a qualified rather than an unqualified pluralism. An open world economy is to be organized on the basis of free labor. Although different countries should be able to continue to compete on the basis of different returns to labor, the different wage. But what is free labor? Is economically dependent wage labor free labor? Or should the arrangements of the world economy create facilities and incentives for the diffusion of the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation? Not self-employment, involuntary self-employment as a disguised form of wage labor, which it very often is in the contemporary economies, but genuine self-employment. That we have to be reconciled with the imperative of aggregation of resources at scale through innovations in the property regime. Well, that's just a schematic evocation of an alternative in the domain of trade. And the kind of alternative that would form the hospitable commercial setting to the kinds of alternatives that we've been discussing in the course of the semester in the national domain. Now, then finally, I come to the point which I referred to before as my third idea. How is this all to happen, or how could it happen in principle? Not by some agitation of the cosmopolitan elite, of the discontented with globalization, but by this pressure from below. Pressure applied by the strong national projects that hit against the limits of the existing form of globalization. They can advance quite a way within the constraints. That was the point of my contrast between Latin America and Northeast Asia or China. When, for example, the Latin Americans say they can't do it because global finance won't allow it, it's not globalization that's to blame. Not even this established form of globalization. It's the functional equivalent to the gold standard that they imposed on themselves, and which is not intrinsic to globalization because there are other parts of the world that don't do it. It's a chain which they put on themselves and which they're blaming on this established form of globalization. They deliberately made themselves depend on financial confidence by opposition to the idea that in early stages of a rebellious project of national development, a country needs a fiscal shield. And that has controversial and surprising implications. So, for example, it has the implication that the need to establish this fiscal shield based on a high level of domestic, private, and public saving trumps the attractions of Keynesian counter-cyclical management of the economy. The Keynesian thesis, which has now flown into the general economic orthodoxy, is that Saving is much more the consequence of economic growth than its cause. And that to insist on it, on the heightening of the level of saving at the outset of a project of development, is to risk some unnecessary constraint on economic growth. The problem with this thesis, this Keynesian or pseudo-orthodox thesis, is that it fails to recognize the strategic significance of the fiscal shield as a condition of rebellion. So the country and its government have to be able to say no to the financial markets and to defy their prescriptions in order to initiate a rebellious strategy of development. If they then succeed, the foreign capital will come anyway. Because in the short run, the foreign capital is attracted by the genuflection to orthodoxy. But in the medium to long run, all the foreign capital cares about is actual economic activity and opportunity for gain. So what is the country that now and for a long time has received the most foreign direct investment? China. Not the Latin Americans who put themselves on their knees in the hope of receiving the foreign capital. The ones who didn't put themselves on their knees. So for the alternative to happen in the domain of world trade, the first stage is the formation of these strong national projects with a fiscal shield. Then some concerted action as ultimately these projects going beyond their initial stages, despite the fact the fiscal shield hit against the constraints. They can advance a certain way and then they're stopped. And then begins the struggle to reshape the global order. That's the second stage. And then comes the third stage in which, as the global order is reshaped in the commercial area, in the monetary domain, and ultimately in the security arrangements, the space for the national alternatives increases yet further. So that's all I wanted to say with respect to the debate about globalization. And there is a central point. It's very simple, but it's fundamental. The simple point is globalization is not there on a take it or leave it basis. It's like all the rest of these arguments we've been having. We don't have to take it or leave it. We can change it. And that's the central point in the discussion. So your comments about this. Yes?
I have a first question. So you said that the current world trade regime has free trade as an end in itself, but in some kind of way it was also seen as a way to ensure peace after World War II.
Yes.
The idea of Montesquieu of the two commerce, and coming from Europe, I know how free trade was instrumental to bringing together
Yes.
their enemies. So these national projects, when they eat against the limits of the current world trade regime, this rebellion, don't you fear that it might also lead to nationalism and ultimately to war?
No, I think the opposite. It is true, as you say, that not just in the second half of the 20th century, but at many points in history, in modern history, there has been the idea that the expansion of trade in the world is a source of peace. But by far the greatest number of those periods, and until very recently, that expansion took place under the aegis of what I call legal and institutional minimalism, not the legal and institutional maximalism. And the problem with the maximalism is that, as I said before, it forcibly turns the champions of national difference into enemies of economic openness. So remember when we were having the more theoretical discussion of nations and the national difference, I said, what's the opposite of the tribe as a conception of the role of the national difference in the world? It's the idea of the national difference as a kind of moral specialization within humanity, different ways of being human. And then on that view, the differences that matter most, that have the greatest potential and interest, are not the ones that have been inherited, but the ones that will be created. And then there's this idea that the problem we have now in the world is that the tangible collective identities are being eviscerated, even as the desire for difference is aroused. And so then there are these two responses. One is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism, which says suppress the will to difference. And the other is the response of national radical democracy, which says equip the will to difference. The abstract will to difference is poisonous because it has the less tangible content the difference has, the less it is susceptible to compromise. There's nothing to compromise. It's the object of an intransigent will. Whereas actual differences are porous and subject to recombination and compromise. And then we say we will respond to this situation not by suppressing the will to difference, but by equipping it. And what I'm calling legal and institutional maximalism is a variant of the suppression of difference, which I'm saying is unnecessary to openness. So it's like a forced marriage between the cause of openness and the cause of harmonization or convergence. It's saying unless you converge, you can't be open. But that's false. It's not true. It's rather the reverse, that the interest in openness is being used as a pretext to impose convergence. But then the practical consequence or cost of that is then that the defenders of difference must become the enemies of openness. And that's part of the confusion that we have in the world about globalization. Yes?
To kind of develop on that same theme, what about arguments that would support a kind of institutional maximalism based, on trade, that would see, for example, the spread of democracy, human rights, and so on? If you look, for example, at the effect of EU accession on Turkey between 2003 and 2013, you would say that there's a marked improvement in human rights, justice standards, and so on. And then if you believe in democratic peace theory and so on, you might believe that it's less likely for this point that we're talking about, less likely for war between nations, but also an improvement of standards along things we actually care about from normative reasons. Yeah. So what about that kind of difference?
Well, so this is the point about what I call qualified pluralism, as opposed to unqualified pluralism. So the idea is free trade is not the aim in itself. The aim is this coexistence in the world of different experiments within a world economic order that gradually becomes more open. But we wouldn't, in principle, want any experiments. We would want to impose qualifications. which are these qualifications of pluralism. And then the same debate about maximalism and minimalism will come up in the definition of this qualified pluralism. We want democracy, but does that mean only the democracy that exists in the North Atlantic world? We want a market order, but does that mean only the market order in the North Atlantic world? That's not the interest, either of these countries or of humanity. So that is a related debate. But if I understand what you're saying, it's the claim made by the advocates of the institutional maximalism that it's a kind of indivisible package. So you have to accept this particular form of the market order with the prohibition of subsidies, the incorporation of intellectual property, and so forth, because that goes together somehow inseparably with these political and civic freedoms. It's illogical. What does the prohibition of subsidies or the incorporation of the 19th century patent regime have to do with these freedoms? So there is this problem of the qualified pluralism. But to my mind, the attempt to make this cause, to pin together a dogmatic version of political pluralism with a dogmatic version of economic pluralism, part of the problem. So one can see what the ideological conception is, but the fundamental objections are the same on every front. That doesn't deny that in a particular historical circumstance, the association of the economic dogma with the political dogma may somehow be better in the short term than the alternative, which is some autocrat conducting crony capitalism and associating it with political despotism. But that's not an acceptable limitation on the argument about the future. And it creates this poisonous situation in which the impulse to national rebellion and difference is then automatically converted into opposition to the open world order, then dubbed globalization. So it's really about fighting our way out of that set of confusions, unpacking them in their elements. Yes?
Just a question to follow up on this. So when you give a more prominent role to national projects, you're basically admitting that some of the national projects will not go towards openness, they will go towards basically totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes. So how can you both open national projects while securing this qualified pluralism, as you said?
But what's the alternative to that? I mean, it's not as if under the institutional maximalism, there were a concerted campaign against despotisms in the world. That's just not true. No one is objecting to the dominant parties are not objecting to the participation of Saudi Arabia or whatever in the system. There's this selective ad hoc combination of alliances and proscriptions. It's not a coherent set of ideas, and it's creating a situation in the world in which the defenders of these strong national projects will become the enemies of that economic openness. That's the central point in the discussion. This doesn't exempt us from the debate and the problem about the deepening of democracy in the world. So I said, when we have the political argument, all the democracies in the world that exist are these weak democracies. Well, then someone can say, well, weak democracy is better than autocracy. Sure. But so what are we to do? Do we stop debating about what the alternative form of democracy is? There's no hope in that direction. That we have to reshape the market order, we have to reshape democracy, and then we have to reshape globalization. And then in a way, the fundamental objection is, if you try to do all this reshaping, there's the risk that things will go off the rails and you'll end up worse than you were before. Well, that in a sense is true. So it's part of all of these arguments. In other words, it's not a distinct problem, it's a pervasive problem in all of these arguments. And at some level, it is true what Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher, said. The business of the future is to be dangerous. And so, but we don't suppress the future. We try and control it and reshape it. Yes?
So something I'm thinking about is when we're talking about forced conformity across countries, clearly there has to be some level of conformity in order for trade to take place. People have to have similar understandings of math at the most basic level.
Still of?
Understandings of like math or like what you're exchanging. Like there has to be some type of similarities across countries in order for trade to work. And so when we see forced institutional conformities, I'd imagine an alternative narrative says that we force institutional conformity because those are the central elements of actually allowing trade. Like those are essential elements of being able to have trade. And furthermore, they might go so far as to say that as globalization increases and you learn more, there's a type of truth-seeking mechanism where we pull back from institutions that aren't actually required. So there's a famous case study somewhat recently about Malaysia and capital controls and how that changed the global orthodoxy about capital controls. So I'd imagine someone might say that there's a truth-seeking function and we pull back or alter which institutions we force other countries to conform with based on what we learn about what's necessary to facilitate trade.
So what's the truth-seeking function? The truth is that this harmonization is required, you mean?
The idea is that the harmonization might be a step along the way to imposing only the necessary institutional requirements to facilitate trade.
Well, but it's all circular. So this is the argument. This is the context in which I mentioned the example of the law merchant. So there's the idea of economists and jurists that transaction costs require harmonization. It's a vast exaggeration because for centuries, what the jurists have been doing in the organization of commerce, of trade, is to show how on the basis of wide and even radical disparities in the law of underlying jurisdictions, we can nevertheless organize commerce. That was the whole point of the law merchant, which is it's a universal law, a common law of world trade, compatible with a very wide range of divergence in the underlying laws. So part of what seems to be happening is that the idea of transaction costs and externalities associated with transaction costs, negative externalities, is being stretched to the point that becomes incompatible with this underlying divergence. Now, from the theoretical standpoint, you could go further. And this is one of the many enigmas in the established tradition of economic theory. Paul Samuelson observed that the single most powerful proposition of economics is the Ricardian doctrine of comparative advantage. And that's part of the theory of trade. The premise of the theory of trade is the division of the world into separate sovereign states with their different arrangements. But there's a mystery in this economics, which is, from the standpoint of pure economics, the division of the world into sovereign states has no economic significance. But at the same time, that's the premise, the predicate of the theory of trade. It has no economic significance, or it has a negative significance, because all it does is generate transaction costs. Why have separate states? There should be a unified world state and a world economy with, in other words, the ultimate outcome of the idea of convergence is to have a single legal order in the world. And then there'd be no problem. There'd be no externalities. There'd be no transaction costs. It's the fantasy of a theory which is a theory of competitive selection, bereft of the theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the method of competitive selection operates. That doesn't make any sense. But it's the product of this idea world, yes.
Yeah, I think maybe slightly different criticism might be that, like, if we agree that there are certain underlying similarities that need to happen in order to facilitate trade, two approaches you could take to find the optimal level of similarity would be either starting with nothing and then building it bit by bit, or starting with maximal similarity and then like reducing that burden bit by bit. And one might argue that our current system is one where, since whatever the IMF, we've imposed a maximally similar set of institutions, and then what we've seen in the past number of decades is we're slowly rolling back into these institutions.
Yes.
And we're still on our way to the optimal level of allowing individual countries to get differences. We're just approaching it from a different angle.
But you're talking as if the cosmopolitan elite were already in power and we're already ruling the world, and it's deciding how much difference it's going to allow. Fortunately, the situation, although bad, is not that bad. And that's not the circumstance that exists in the world. So I propose a different thought experiment from the two circumstances that you suggested, which is the question for the practical jurist is, by what route, by what devices, can the greatest degree of difference be reconciled with the greatest degree of openness? And that's one of the problems that the practical jurists have been trying to solve and solving for centuries. So the issue of how you can have more openness with more difference is ultimately a practical issue that depends on the creation of these legal devices. That's what they've been doing. But that's different from a mindset which ultimately wants convergence and then uses the requirements of residual or minimal harmonization as the pretext to get the convergence that wants, obviously for other reasons, which are all being packed into this idea of transaction costs and practical necessities. Yes.
So there are these economists and Hausner and Glenn Wiley proposed this idea of individuals being able to sponsor immigrants instead of companies doing the same.
Speak a little louder so they can hear you in the back.
Okay, so the idea that's been proposed is that individuals can come and sponsor immigrants instead of companies, kind of like an H-1B. And you also mentioned before that the kind of free trade that you want with the labor mobility is one where the people working aren't slaves. And I was wondering how you can draw this distinction between when someone's working for another party, whether that counts as like slavery or is something of free will.
But wait a minute, this is a question about immigration or about self-employment? I didn't understand.
So my question just is centered
Now, a wage labor, but this isn't a theoretical question. This is a practical question. It's in the courts in the United States and in many countries in the world. Is an Uber driver a contractor, as they want to say he is, or is he an employee? It's being litigated. So what's happening in the world is that, as I mentioned, there's this expansion of precarious employment. And one of the typical forms in which precarious employment expands is as pseudo self-employment. Self-employment that is disguised wage labor as a way of escaping labor commitments, health benefits, and so forth. So it's a simulacrum of self-employment. And it's being debated. So there are legal standards that are developed in the laws of the different countries to distinguish when de facto there is an employment relation. So it's not as if a relation can be made a pure contractual, non-employment relation just because the employer says it is. You have to look to the reality of the circumstance. And then the courts and the jurists develop these standards that help differentiate true from false self-employment. It's a very important subject, going to this question of free labor. Now, yes?
One of the points that you raised about when describing institutional maximalism
Yes.
was the kind of existence of strategic coordination between firms and the governments themselves.
Yes.
Subsidies, the same way that we used to talk about compensatory redistribution as being a negative effect on the efficiency of a single system, are you saying that subsidies have a role in reaching a more efficient kind of global market? Or is it more so the case that subsidies also kind of, as you mentioned before, disrupt the party like the comparative advantage?
So the problem is in the concept of subsidies, which is an elastic concept. It's like a weasel concept. So there's a spectrum from the government establishing a framework that supports a new kind of market and a new range of products and giving a subsidy. So I gave in an earlier point in the course in another context the example of the creation of family-scale agriculture in the United States in the early 19th century. So it would never have happened without the intervention of the state, because the state distributed the lands, the state organized the technical and economic basis of agriculture through the land-grant colleges, and then it brought the knowledge of the land-grant colleges to the farmer at the grassroots level. All of that, depending on how you expand the idea of subsidies, could be described as a subsidy. After all, aren't the land-grant colleges a subsidy? And the system of agricultural extension? And then agriculture suffers a unique problem among economic activities, which is the combination of price volatility with climate volatility. And we know from historical experience that it goes under. It doesn't survive unless there are a set of instruments, forms of insurance and hedging, that secure it against this combination of risks. Those have to be initiated by law, by the state, and so forth. So the result is the expansion of economic opportunity, the creation of a new form of agency of agents. It wasn't the regulation of the agricultural market, it was the creation of a new kind of agricultural market. But packed into that is some public investment combined with private investment. Now, the problem is, if we're going to have an expansive concept of subsidies, what we are in effect doing is to prohibit the reconfiguration of the market order. because the reconfiguration of the market order is always going to depend on some collaboration of the state with emergent private agents. And one of the components of that collaboration at different points, as in the example I just gave, will be some element of public investment. So this shows very clearly in the example the whole direction of what I'm calling the institutional and legal maximalism. The direction is to freeze the present form of the market order in place. And then we have this rhetorical situation in the world, which is that if I propose to the practical orthodox economist a scheme for the expansion of opportunity, like an industrial equivalent to 19th century agricultural extension, the tendency will be for him to hear that as if it were some form of state intervention. Because in his mind, the market means the market that now exists, as opposed to another market that we might create on the basis of the present market. So it's like another level of confusion. That's the problem of subsidies. And that's why I'm resisting thinking of them in the vocabulary that you invoked just now.
But what about like subsidies that are, I guess, like less interested in reconfiguring the market?
Yes.
Interested in simply capturing market share in the existing market. I'm thinking specifically of like the Chinese factory argument, like almost the previous lines of
Yeah.
like wouldn't this be an example?
Well, of course, it's a question of the spectrum. It's a question of the spectrum, but we have to go into the details. Because in many of those circumstances that initially might seem to be simply attempts to tilt the scales, it's likely that if we look further, we'd see that something else is going on, like the development of the high technology sector, for example, or its expansion outside of its traditional area. So there'll always be this combination. So it's not that this isn't a real problem, but the issue is the way of thinking and the direction. And once again, the argument goes in saying, let's be minimalist. Let's, with respect to this idea of subsidies and tilting the scales, the egregious and direct. Let's not use this expansively in a form that chills the necessary institutional experiments. And I think that's the fundamental difference of emphasis and direction and attitude, which is what is meant by the debate about legal and institutional maximalism. Well, let me go on to the discussion of ideas. And so I said there are three sets of ideas I want to discuss with you. They're related to the way of thinking. And it's one of the reasons to have a programmatic discussion in the academic setting is that we can't rethink, we can't develop the programmatic imagination without intellectual rebellion. The established ways of thinking in the world are hostile to what we need to do intellectually. And the result are a series of conundrums that I want at least to signal to you. So what do we need? What kinds of ideas do we need in thinking about structure? We need ideas that preserve the vital link between understanding what exists insight into the actual, and understanding transformative possibility, what something can become under certain provocations or interventions. To understand a phenomenon in any field of thought, of science, of inquiry, is always to understand what it can become. If we don't have transformative insight, we don't have insight, period. We're not seeing something, we're just staring at it. And we must, with respect to society, be able to distinguish the formative institutions and arrangements, the formative institutions and assumptions from the surface of social life, the shaped routines. So what generally happens in the contemporary social sciences and the contemporary policy discourse is the evasion of structural insight. And the evasion takes place in many different ways. But there is a common element in these different forms of evasion. So the common element is the naturalization of the existing organization of society. It's as if you said, if we look at society, we see there's an incessant activity of balancing interests or solving problems. And the arrangements and assumptions are simply, as it were, the residues of all of these past acts of interest balancing and problem solving. In other words, there's no distinct problem about the framework. And as a result, the order of society is naturalized, is made to appear as if it were natural. Then the link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible of this transformative opportunity is severed. That's what we find. Now, let me suggest to you how it happens. So first, in the technocratic or technical policy discourse, we see a heap of discrete problems and possible technical solutions to them. And there are no structural presuppositions. It's as if the framework were invisible or irrelevant. It's just one problem after another. So that's the policy discourse. Now, what about the social sciences? Each of the social sciences naturalizes the surrounding social space in a different way. So it's like the remark at the beginning of Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The unhappiness of the different social sciences are the distinct forms of subterfuge, of evasion, of the imperative of structural insight. So take the most influential and well-organized social science, economics, as it emerged from the marginalist revolution of the 19th century. And consider in economics the institutional focus, how it approaches institutions, given that that's been our main subject here. So from the standpoint of institutions, you could say there are three types of economics resulting from the marginalist revolution. Each of them suppresses structural insight in a different way. So the first type of economics you could call pure economics, like the general equilibrium analysis of the mid-20th century. It makes no institutional assumptions. It's institutionally empty. In fact, there was a debate in the middle of the 20th century about whether the analytic apparatus of economics could be applied to command economies. And the conclusion was, yes, it can. It's a form of logic, as the Austrian economists argued at the time. A kind of quasi-logic, empty of institutional content and significance. And the logical machine works only on the basis of the fuel of factual stipulations, causal theories, or normative commitments supplied from the outside. So the relation there to institutions is the relation of agnosticism. You give me the assumptions and I'll work with my logic. Now, then there's a second kind of economics, which you could call fundamentalist economics. Example are the ideas of Hayek and his followers. So there the conception is rationality is embodied in the market, competitive selection, and the market is identified with a very particular set of laws and institutions that developed in early modern Europe and that achieved its consummate form in the private law of the 19th century, the law of property and contract. So the assumption is if Robinson Crusoe continued long enough trading in his island, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of 19th century German private law. This is an absurd claim, but it's actually the central belief of this kind of economics. And the whole tendency of the evolution of legal thought for 150 years has been to demonstrate the opposite, that the abstract idea of the market has no determinate legal content. Now then there's a third kind of economics, which I'm going to call equivocating economics. And it is illustrated by the analytic and argumentative practice of the American macroeconomists. Who reduce Keynes's doctrine to a kind of theory of counter-cyclical management of the economy by fiscal and monetary policy. And this is and they then call that macroeconomics and superimposed it on the untransformed body of the received economic theory, which they relabeled microeconomics. And so rather than being two rival theoretical paradigms, they ended up as two parts of the textbook of the same system of ideas. So that's what happened. And it has an equivalent in the evolution of 20th century law. The new regulatory and redistributive law of the second half of the 20th century was superimposed on a largely untransformed body of private law. So this macroeconomist then seeks to establish law-like regularities between large-scale economic aggregates, like the levels of saving, investment, and employment. For example, a constant regularity between the level of inflation and the level of employment. That's the so-called Phillips curve. Now here's the problem. These supposed regularities depend on a host of background detailed institutional arrangements. It's not just an abstraction like capitalism or the market economy, or even the regulated market economy. It's a whole set of details, institutional and legal details. For example, the level of unemployment insurance, how the unemployment insurance is awarded, and so forth. If you change any part of that background, the regularities shift. So the Phillips curve existed, then it doesn't exist, or it exists in a different form. That's what was discovered. It's like some moving target. So then you object, well, you say, these aren't laws, because they're changing all the time, and they depend on this institutional background. Then the macroeconomist concedes, in principle, that they depend on the background. But if, in fact, the background is largely stagnant, he can disregard this concession in his argumentative and analytic practice. So he goes back to doing what he was doing before. And the stagnant or stable arrangements acquire then this mendacious semblance of lawfulness. That's another way to suppress structural insight. So what you see is that these three variants of economics each suppress structural insight in a different way. Now, if we went through all of the social sciences, sociology, political science, anthropology, we would see the same kind of thing happening, but always in a different form. As if it were a conspiracy, a spontaneous and enthusiastic conspiracy to produce a mystification of social life through this severing of the link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. Now, then we come to so that was the policy discourse, the social sciences, illustrated by economics, the most powerful. And now we come to the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory. So, the theories of justice that are predominant now in the Anglo-American Academy. And they seem to be very abstract and very egalitarian. But what are they in fact? They are, through the use of conceptual schemes like social contract, they are pseudo-philosophical props to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So that's the whole object of the exercise, to provide the philosophy of progressive taxation and social entitlements. So the philosophers all agree about the bottom line. The bottom line is some form of institutionally conservative liberal social democracy. They only disagree about the top line. In what philosophical vocabulary should this outcome that they all agree on be expounded? And we have the similar operation in legal theory. So the law is represented as an idealized system in the vocabulary of impersonal policy and principle to make it appear that the compromises of the mid-20th century regulated market order are in fact approximations to an intelligible and defensible plan of social life, such as a single mind might conceive, and then represent in the language of policy and principle. And they are attempts then to provide the theory of these ameliorative exercises the idealization of law in the language of policy and principle, or compensatory and retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer. So in the social sciences, we have rationalization. In the normative disciplines, we have humanization. And what do we have in the humanities? We have escapism. So there, the consciousness embarks on a roller coaster of subjectivist adventurism and completely dissociated from the reimagination of the structure of social life, this fatal parting of the ways between modernism and leftism. So those are the tendencies of the high academic culture: rationalization, humanization, and escapism. The representatives of each tendency pretend to be enemies. We know that they're all allies in the disarmament of the transformative will and imagination. That's the circumstance. So that then leads us to think that the situation in the high academic culture is part of the problem, not part of the solution. So far, so good. Should I go on? Yes.
To what do you attribute the tendency then of all the disciplines to shy away from the truth?
Shy away from the truth. So yes. So how have we lost this impulse of transformative imagination? So that's a very complicated story, because to answer that question, you need the whole of history. The history of ideas, the history of ideas, and the history of politics. Because but the simple answer has two main elements, right? So one element is the ideological calamities of the 20th century. These ideologies that attempted a radical transformation of society, and that resulted, for the most part, in catastrophes. And then in the most successful, richest countries, the social democratic compromise became the predominant political view. And remember, it was characterized by a retreat from the attempt to reshape institutionally the worlds of power and production. So that became the fundamental historical experience, the experience that the alternatives are either illusory or dangerous or both, that the real world is the world of this compromise, of this convergence. That's the experience. The experience is the background then to this evasion of structural insight. So that's part of the answer. But another part of the answer has to do with the history of ideas, that there was an earlier moment of the attempt to form a theory with a structural direction, and it was tainted in the way that I'm now going to describe. So we go back then to what came before, to classical European social theory, and especially to its consummate expression, Marxism. And so what is the revolutionary insight at the heart of that theory, of that theoretical tradition? So it's the tradition that had greatest influence on the left, on the progressives throughout the world, is this idea that the structures of society are not natural, they're made and imagined. We made them. They are our creations. And as Vico said earlier, because we made them, we can understand them, as the creator understands his creations. We're external to the natural phenomena, but we're not external to our own creations, or shouldn't be. But the problem is that we then fail to recognize them for what they are, as it were, the frozen and alienated parts of our own selves, and we treat them as if they were part of the furniture of the universe. So that was the central idea of classical European social theory, and especially of Marxism. And if you radicalize that idea, if you push it to the hilt, you could think of it this way, that history is the history of our conflict and contest, practical and visionary strife over the terms of social life, which are the terms of our access to one another. And this conflict is temporarily interrupted or relatively contained constantly. And when it is contained and interrupted, to the extent that it's contained or interrupted, these arrangements emerge. Those are the structures. So on this view, the structures are frozen politics. If by politics we mean this contest over the terms of social life, the frozen fighting, the residues of this struggle. This was the revolutionary idea. But this idea was compromised in the history of classical European social theory by three sets of illusions, each of which had vast practical political consequences. And I'm exploring these illusions in the context of the most powerful expression of these ideas, the Karl Marx's theory of society and of history. So the first set of illusions is the closed list illusion. There's a closed menu of alternative regimes in history. So in Marxism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. And the practical implication of this view is that each of these institutions each of these regimes has a predefined institutional and legal content. So a society, when it becomes one of these regimes, can't choose a different content for it. The content is predetermined. So, for example, capitalism comes with a built-in system of law. There can be small variations, but the basic arrangements of private law are intrinsic to the capitalist regime. And what's interesting is that this assumption in Marxism is the same assumption of classical 19th century legal theory. It was the same central assumption. The project of legal science is to unpack the intrinsic legal and institutional content of the type. It's a typological idea. So there's a legal architecture that is intrinsic to the type. Now, all the arguments we've been having here are against that notion, incompatible with that notion. The market order, and it has all these possible variations. So the structure is not a system, and there isn't this closed menu. Now comes the second illusion. The second illusion is the indivisibility illusion. So each of these systems is an indivisible package. All the parts go together. And this has a practical consequence of decisive significance. The practical consequence is a binary view of politics. There are two kinds of politics. There's the reformist management of a system, and there's the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. So if politics is not revolutionary, it must be reformist. Now, this is an idea of vast influence in the world. Think of it this way, the would-be progressive or leftist says, well, the real transformation would be the substitution of one system for another, capitalism by socialism. That's not in the cards. If it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to manage the existing system. So then there's this idea that the idea of the revolutionary substitution is subtly converted into an alibi for its opposite. And that's what's happened in the world to a very large extent. So many countries in the world are governed by disillusioned ex-Marxists who now become these institutionally conservative social democrats or Keynesians. And because they have this idea justifying this convergence. So what does the idea exclude? What the idea excludes is what is in fact the case, that real structural change in the world is almost always fragmentary and is piecemeal, but can become more radical if it persists in a certain direction. So the binary idea of politics excludes the possibility of combining a fragmentary and gradualist method with a radical or revolutionary outcome. That's what it deems impossible. But in the world of historical experience, the systemic change is like a limiting case, a projection of change that is always, to some extent or another, fragmentary, more fragmentary, less fragmentary. So this was discovered very early on in the history of social theory. When, for example, Tocqueville, in his book on the Ancien Regime, had as his main theme that France after the revolution was in many respects very much like France before the revolution. Now comes the third illusion. The third illusion is that there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these indivisible regimes in history. And that too has a practical consequence. The practical consequence is that we don't need to have a project. History has a project for us. And the whole notion of having a project is a voluntarist illusion. So there is a project, which is the script. History has a script, and we have to understand the script. The script is the real project. The rest is just fantasy. So this is the central problem in, now if we can, this is the idea element, the question you ask, why this suppression of structural insight? So there's this other element in the history of ideas. There was this revolutionary insight. The insight was entangled in these illusions. And as a result, the original theory has become literally incredible. And so this is another feature of the situation in the world. People continue to use these words like capitalism and so forth, which depend on the heroic assumptions of a theoretical system in which they no longer believe. So there's a system, capitalism. It has laws. It's indivisible. Do they really believe that? Apparently not. But they use the vocabulary as if they believed in it. So there's this pervasive confusion, and the absence of ideas that based on premises, they could be defended. Disorienting transformative practice. Now, this angle that I've just taken in the description of Marxism and of classical European social theory is different from the standard, from the most common critique of this theory. The most common critique is that it is vitiated by its reliance on functionalist explanation. A functionalist explanation is an explanation that takes the consequences of something as its cause. So, for example, the Darwinian theory of natural selection is a species of functional explanation, because differential success in the environment then becomes the cause, through some mechanism of differential survival, of the phenomenon. So what's the functionalist explanation of Marxism? A certain regime allows the forces of production to develop. It produces the goods, develops our practical powers. That explains its diffusion in the world. Now, it's obvious that a very important element in historical explanation is functional. The problem isn't the functional element in the explanation. The problem is the association of the functional explanation with these three sets of illusions, these deep structure assumptions that it's a system. The limited menu, the indivisible regimes, the laws governing the foreordained succession. That's the problem. So we have this classical idea of structure vitiated by a kind of historical fatalism. And then in the contemporary situation, social science and thought, we have the suppression of structural insight. So instead of trying to radicalize the initial idea and liberate it from the vitiating illusions, the whole project of focusing on structure and structural alternatives was abandoned or suppressed. And so that's a simple description of our situation. So that's where we are. So if we look around us, we see a series of forms of rationalization, humanization, and escapism in the high culture. If we look back to the history of classical social theory, we see this great project in which the revolutionary insight was compromised by the illusions surrounding it, with which it was entangled. So somehow we would have to return to that idea and liberate it from its shell of illusions. The rational kernel in the mystical shell, as Marx said of Hegel. And so what are we to do? We're not going to wait for the other Karl Marx. We say, we require genius to liberate us. No, we have to develop, as the counterpart to our programmatic ideas and our transformative practice, a different approach in some fragmentary form. It doesn't have to be some system that a single mind formulates. But it has to have certain attributes. So it has to say, structure matters, but structure is not system. These structures, which are the formative institutional arrangements and assumptions of a social world, are ramshackle constructions. They're not systems. Their different parts may reinforce each other, but they can't be deduced from one another, and they don't change all of a piece. That's not how they change. Institutional abstractions like a market economy, a democratic politics, or an independent civil society have no single natural and necessary institutional form. They're always indeterminate. There is a powerful element of functional explanation in history. Different ways of organizing a society or an economy can be more or less successful. But the same functional imperative can always be achieved through alternative institutional arrangements. There's never just one institutional response to a functional imperative. And consequently, the evolution of these institutional arrangements always selects from contingent sequences of ideological and practical history. It doesn't select from some closed menu of alternative systems in history. So little by little, step by step, without having a system of ideas, a comprehensive social theory, we must develop a way of thinking. So to my mind, the project of formulating a comprehensive social theory is still an appealing and feasible project. I'm not outlawing it. I find it irresistible as an intellectual ambition. But it shouldn't be the only form or the normal form of this alternative intellectual practice. Friedrich Schlegel said 2 things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system and the other is not to have one. So the systematic form shouldn't be the necessary form of this intellectual ambition, or the only form. So this is a very tall order. Even if you put aside the idea that there has to be a comprehensive theory, a revolution in social and political theory, even if you consider it the piecemeal development of a way of thinking, it's a very demanding task. Because it says there's this work of the programmatic imagination is not intellectually innocent. It requires ideas. And the problem is the ideas that are available in the high academic culture of today, on the one hand, and in the history of classical social theory, on the other, are not good enough. They're not what we need, or they're only partly what we need. And we don't have these ideas, so we have to make them along the way, this way of thinking. And we can't just turn to the academy and say, well, give us the ideas, your ideas. So we say, to have these programmatic conceptions, we need an economics, for example, but not the economics that exists, another economics, and so forth. Well, that's the real situation. It's just incredibly, it's surprising, and it's full of difficulty and astonishment and possibility. And in that respect, it's like politics. So in the next class, I want to discuss the ideas about agency they're related to these ideas about structure, and then the ideal element, the vision of humanity in these programmatic arguments. But I do want you to begin preparing your questions and comments about the arguments of the course as a whole. So we might start that next class, and the whole last class will be reserved for that purpose.